Tonight's topic, as you know, is a grand bargain with North Korea, ? And it's a kind of an answer, I believe, to the book which our guest this evening has recently co-authored, Crisis on the Korean Peninsula, How to Deal with a Nuclear North Korea. It's a wonderful topic, and it reminds all of us that in our diplomatic relations at the moment, it is as true as it's ever been that it's complicated to find a diplomatic resolution. A grand diplomatic resolution is the alternative to armed conflict. We lived for 50 years during the Cold War with a very clear-cut, I believe, diplomatic strategy paralleling the acts of containment. It's not so clear that following the collapse of the Soviet Union that we designed a diplomatic strategy to deal with what were newly perceived threats, the so-called rogue states. But in any case, it remains a great question in front of us. It's wonderful that Dr. O'Hanlon is focusing upon it so directly with an immediate, important case. We certainly look forward to his articulation of the topic. Dr. O'Hanlon's obviously deeply prepared for this. He spent a lot of time thinking about the Korean matters, and he spent a career dealing with defense questions as well as general policy questions. All of his degrees, graduate degrees, are from Princeton University. In fact, his undergraduate degree is from Princeton, his master's degree as well, both in the physical sciences, interestingly, and his PhD is in public and international affairs. He worked as an analyst at the Congressional Budget Office. He was at the Institute for Defense Analyses before joining Brookings in 1994. He's written 5 books. He's co-authored an additional 3 or 4, including the one which I emphasize now, dealing with the Korean crisis. He has addressed in articles and in study the important questions of our time. He's dealt with Iraq, he's dealt with Afghanistan, with China, with NATO, and now in this work with the Korean Peninsula. It's my great pleasure to present to you Michael O'Hanlon, Brookings Institution, who's dealing with what I think is the most important question. Dr. O'Hanlon.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Frank, and it's a real treat to be here. I wanted to begin by saying that I've now given talks on this subject on a very nice sunny day in Washington, a very nice sunny day in San Francisco, and a very nice sunny day in Seoul, South Korea. And the combined attendance of those 3 events, I think, is less than you folks on this rainy night in Baltimore. So my hat's off to you. As you all know, this is an extraordinarily important topic, and I think your attendance is partly a reflection of the energy of your organization and also a reflection of how important you realize this issue is today. It doesn't tend to get a lot of headlines, and frankly, my publisher and I are a little discouraged by book sales because, of course, it's Iraq, Iraq, Iraq. And it has to be at some level. The Iraq mission is certainly dominating much of our energy these days, and it's dominating much of our future dealings with the Arab and Islamic worlds, and these are enormously important questions. But we've all been thinking enough and talking enough about that. I don't want to tonight. I want to talk about a situation that, by at least objective measures, could be said to be at least as serious. We have a Stalinist regime with a 1 million-person army, a broken economy, and a nuclear weapons program, and no clear way of fixing this. And also a situation that, at least in its basic structure, looks awfully serious because whether you like Bill Clinton or not, whether you think he was strong on defense or not, Bill Clinton's administration found the idea of North Korean nuclear weapons unacceptable. These were the lefties of the Democratic Party who, back in 1994, in the person of Bill Perry, Secretary of Defense at the time, said, we cannot accept a North Korean nuclear arsenal. And we were beginning to gin up the machinery to deploy more forces to the Korean Peninsula and potentially consider a preemptive strike on North Korean nuclear capabilities, even though there was no preemption doctrine at the time, even though it was Bill Clinton in his worst and weakest moments as President of the United States, having had trouble with Haiti and Somalia in recent months. That administration found the idea of a North Korean nuclear program so objectionable and so unsettling to American security interests. Even in a pre-9/11 world, they were prepared to risk war to deal with it. And now we have a world where we have a tough administration, or at least wants to be seen as muscular, a post-9/11 environment, North Korea having at least once publicly threatened to export nuclear materials to terrorist organizations, or at least to foreign buyers, if circumstances were not properly controlled. And yet somehow it doesn't rate on the public radar screen in this country, and it barely rates on Mr. Bush's radar screen. Last year, for example, at the holidays, Colin Powell was on TV saying it's not really a crisis. Well, I'm a big fan of Mr. Powell, and I'm sure most of you are too, but goodness sakes, Mr. Powell, if this is not a crisis, what is? So I'm glad you came out, because it seems to me the issue deserves a lot more attention than it gets. Having said that, and in the interest of not sounding like a Bush basher, because I think this issue is too important to get quickly partisan about, let me say that I was very struck on my trip to East Asia a couple of weeks ago by how gratified our allies were that Mr. Bush was in Bangkok at the time talking about North Korea policy, trying to coordinate, trying to come up with a better plan, and he has been spending some time on the issue. He's actually got his own approach to dealing with the Korea crisis that really bears his personal signature, the idea of multilateral talks, using these 6-country talks to try to work out a deal. And he spent a lot of time in East Asia focused on this problem. So even though it has not been the primary focus of the last year in American policy, I think we're starting to see a little better treatment of it now. Okay, let me do a few things with my remarks tonight. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking at you. I'd rather interact and get your comments and questions. So let me try to do 4 things. Let me try to review very quickly where we stand with recent developments. Let me then try to say the basic quandary we're in, the basic catch-22 that we face. Then I want to say a couple words about the grand bargain proposal, which, by the way, we think is a good idea even if you're a hawk, and even if you ultimately don't think it'll work. We still think it's the right thing to propose. And we want to convince you, my co-author Mike Mochizuki and I, we want to convince you that we're not really some woolly-headed liberals from Brookings and George Washington University, that we really have a plan that even if you think toughness is going to be needed with the North Koreans, this is the way to get there. Because if you don't try diplomacy first, you really can't get tough. So I want to make that case and lay out the grand bargain, which I hope will work, but which may not. And therefore which has to be judged partly on its ability to set us up for what might be necessary after it fails. And then finally, and I'm anticipating this already, I want to go through some of what you might say are the obvious objections to the grand bargain proposal and try to rebut a couple of my critics before I'm sure you come at me yourselves in the discussion period. So let me do those 4 things in turn, a few minutes on each one. Let me also, while I'm warming up, say a couple words about my co-author. He's, as I say, a professor at George Washington University and an expert on East Asian security issues. I'm a generalist. I hope that doesn't mean I'm just a dilettante, but even if it does, at least we have one co-author on this team who really is a regional expert. And Mike is a specialist on U.S.-Japan relations in particular, but has certainly followed the region more generally for 30 or so years of his career. And we've been talking about this proposal for a grand bargain, the 2 of us, and developing some of the various pieces of it for 7 or 8 years, going back to the mid-1990s when he was also at Brookings. And we decided to write the book once the crisis became so acute. And as you know, and I'll start now to lead into my review of the recent history, the crisis really became acute in October of 2002, because that's when Assistant Secretary of State James Kelly confronted the North Koreans with our knowledge at that point that the North Koreans were cheating on the 1994 agreed framework. This was, as you know, the framework that had basically said to them, you stop your nuclear weapons activities and you stop producing plutonium at these big 2 reactors at Yongbyon, and we will, in turn, provide you a substitute in terms of the energy. And the substitute will ultimately involve nuclear reactors, but a type that are not as good at producing plutonium. And this was a deal that had a lot of problems from both sides throughout the 1990s, but lo and behold, it turned out the North Koreans were cheating. They had an underground uranium enrichment program. This was in complete violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which they were obliged to honor, both because they had signed that treaty and because the agreed framework of '94 reinforced it. There's just no question that the North Koreans made the flagrant violation here. Some people would dispute my interpretation, but I would say through the 1990s we had a back and forth period of delay, of obfuscation, of frustration on both sides. We were still moving forward, but the North Koreans turned out to be developing this uranium enrichment program underground somewhere else, and we found it. For those people who would blame President Bush for North Korean behavior, it's very important to recognize the uranium enrichment program began about 1998. It began when Bill Clinton was in the White House and when there was a fairly tough-minded South Korean president who then was replaced by Kim Dae-jung, the Nobel Prize-winning father of sunshine policy. So the South Koreans had a tough president in the 97-98 timeframe. We had a somewhat more diplomacy-oriented president. Even under those circumstances, the North Koreans decided to start this program. When preemption doctrine was not out there, when Bill Clinton was no longer threatening to attack because we had reached the agreed framework. So I don't think you can blame President Bush for this program. And yet, it was under President Bush's watch that we found it. And so Assistant Secretary of State Kelly confronted the North Koreans with this news, this discovery in October 2002. The North Koreans couldn't decide if they wanted to admit it or deny it or do both. They did a little bit of both. Then we had the period through the holidays. The Bush administration was ginning up the country for war against Iraq, did not really welcome a second major crisis in a country that arguably already had nuclear weapons, as best we could tell. So they tried to downplay it. That led to Colin Powell's remarks about how this is not really a crisis. And then we tried to go back and forth and talk to the North Koreans through the wintertime. But ultimately, they threw out the inspectors, they withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and they told us they were going ahead with their nuclear program. And that was basically what happened in the winter of 2002-2003. Now, since that time, as you know, there's been an effort to get diplomacy going. And there's been some progress, at least in procedural terms. There's been no progress in resolving the underlying security problem. But in April, we finally found a way to talk to the North Koreans in China. And the Chinese were also present at these talks. We had been insisting any talks had to be multilateral. The North Koreans had been insisting any talks had to be bilateral. How do you compromise with that? Well, the Chinese were very clever and helpful and creative and said, why don't you all come to Beijing and we'll sit at the table as well. The Americans can say it's multilateral because we'll be there. And the North Koreans can say it's bilateral because the South Koreans won't be there. The Japanese won't be there. And it's basically a one-on-one with the United States, and China's sort of playing the role of MC. So everybody worked out a deal they could live with. Unfortunately, the talks didn't go so well because that was the occasion when the North Koreans talked about nuclear capability in their possession and talked about the possibility even of exporting that capability. And in the post-9/11 world, what could be more, just more sobering, more unacceptable, and more petrifying to an American than to hear the concept of a nuclear state with a very bad track record of selling weapons abroad, threatening to sell nuclear materials, and perhaps even to Al-Qaeda, for all we knew. Well, the good news is the North Koreans haven't repeated that comment. Perhaps because the Chinese or someone else told them, if you do that, you are asking for trouble. George Bush may have half of his U.S. Army deployed in Iraq, but if you start talking about exporting nuclear materials to Al-Qaeda, he may have to come after you anyway. Bill Clinton might have come after you anyway under those circumstances. This is not a threat the United States can accept, so do not make the threat in those terms. And therefore, at the talks that were held in late August in Beijing again, and now with Russia, Japan, and South Korea also present, the North Koreans did not repeat that threat. But they also did not show any willingness to reach a deal on the terms being offered to them by the Bush administration, and they had no particular counterproposal of their own in any specificity. They also realized that we're going to have to we're going to have to take the lead on this. The United States has most of the cards. The North Koreans are a small country with a broken economy. They couldn't win a war if it occurred. They need help from the outside. They are in a position of weakness. They try to make up for it with bluster and nuclear weapons, but they cannot really drive the negotiation because they don't have the capability to produce an integrated plan. They waited for our integrated plan. We didn't have one. The Bush administration at that time prepared a plan that was really just a couple of specific provisions. And the Bush administration said to the North Koreans, listen, you have to give up your nuclear weapons. These are unacceptable. They're in violation of every treaty that we can think of that you've signed in the last 10 to 20 years. It's a major risk to our security. It's an unacceptable reflection of your militarized society. It's wrong to have the nuclear weapons. Get rid of them. And then we'll talk about everything else. Then we'll talk about diplomatic relations. Then we'll talk about economic benefits. But not before, because you're in the wrong, and you've got to come right before we'll offer you any benefits. And we're not willing to appease you. We're not willing to give in to extortion. And when you think about it in normal terms, President Bush was right. I mean, we're dealing with a Stalinist regime with an atrocious human rights record, with a broken economy, with a history of aggression, developing nuclear weapons, violating treaties. Why is Mr. Bush supposed to offer them anything at all? Well, I would submit to you the reason is because he has no choice. And the question, to my mind, and this is what motivated our book, the question is, how do you offer the North Koreans a way out of this dead end they've backed themselves into without being guilty of giving in to extortion, without being guilty of giving in to blackmail, without setting a precedent you cannot live with, and without encouraging even more subsequent North Korean behavior of the same type? So that was for us the challenge. And that's my review of the history, and it leads me into my second comment or second observation, the question of what kind of a quandary do we face today? And to me, it's basically a catch-22. We are stuck. For all the reasons I just mentioned, we cannot and should not offer the North Koreans major incentives just to give up their nuclear weapons. They already were supposed to give up their nuclear weapons once under one previous deal. They are violating all these treaties that they have sworn to uphold. They are breaking down precedents that the international community must uphold in order to preserve international peace. So we cannot, in good conscience or with any kind of credible strategic consistency, offer the North Koreans a lot of benefits and a lot of goodies to give up their nuclear weapons. So that's one quandary. On the other hand, if we don't offer them any benefits, they're not going to give up the weapons because it's about the only thing they've got. And moreover, they actually are getting nervous, I think, about President Bush. And maybe they didn't develop that underground uranium enrichment program because of a fear of the United States, but they may actually have a fear of the United States now. All the talk of an axis of evil, of preemption doctrine, of rogue states, and so forth, may have convinced the North Koreans that they have some reasons to worry that Mr. Bush may come after them next. So that's the catch-22. We cannot really offer them anything for the nuclear program. That's one option that doesn't look very good. On the other hand, if we don't offer them anything, they're going to keep it. So what do you do? Well, our book basically takes an adage out of Secretary Rumsfeld's playbook. I'm not saying Mr. Rumsfeld agrees with our proposal. I have no reason to think he does. But although I gave him a copy of the book and I said, inscribed it as a fellow Princetonian, I hope you read this, and I have no idea if he has, and we guess he hadn't. But in any event, he does have one adage that we like to build on in this book, which is, if you have a problem you can't solve, enlarge it. This is a famous Rumsfeldism. I'm told that he got it from Eisenhower. I don't know who made it up first, but it really makes sense here, because the idea is you have to get beyond the narrow focus on the nuclear question. Now, I know if you're reading the paper, you might say, yeah, but the North Koreans, all they're asking for is this piece of paper that's a non-aggression treaty or a non-aggression pact. And if we give them that, they've sort of suggested they'll give up their nuclear weapons. So why don't we just give them the non-aggression pact or the non-aggression treaty, make them feel reassured that we're not going to attack, and then we can maybe solve this nuclear problem. I don't believe it. For one thing, Mr. Bush has actually made some progress in addressing the North Korean demand. In the meetings he was in the APEC summit 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago in Asia, he talked about a multilateral security pledge that other countries would also be part of, which in my mind should actually increase the credibility of the pledge, not reduce it. That would say we're all committed not to attacking each other. North Korea doesn't like the idea. North Korea immediately rejected it. Since that time, they've actually hedged a little bit, shown a little more openness. But they don't seem to like the idea. And moreover, I don't believe that they could really accept just a piece of paper for giving up a nuclear weapons program. They have big problems, and they have maybe 1 or 2 assets to try to figure out a way to address those problems. They have an economy that's shrunk in half in the last 15 years, since the Soviet subsidies dried up, since trade with the communist world dried up, since a lot of their arms exports dried up, because they're only exporting about 1/6 or 1/8 of what they used to, because there's no market left for a lot of the weapons they produce. Their economy has just fallen through the floor. Now, admittedly, they've recovered a little bit. Thankfully, starvation is not as bad in North Korea today as it was in the late 1990s. There's a fair amount of food aid going in. They may have actually improved a little bit of their economic operations and activities since the late 90s. They've tried to move towards some very basic economic reforms, some farmers' markets and some liberalization of prices, but they're still in a broken economy. And they still have virtually no meaningful contact with the outside world except with China and South Korea. They realize they need help from us as well. And if they're going to have any way of digging out of this hole, it's going to have to be a bigger deal than just a piece of paper that says we're not going to attack them. Because they started this nuclear program at a time when there was no reason to think we were going to attack them anyway, in the late years of the Clinton presidency. Even then, they thought they needed a nuclear program. I would submit it's because they thought this would give them leverage in negotiation and help them extort resources. That's the same thing they tried to do with their missile program in the late 1990s. And those of you who have been reading Madeleine Albright's book or following the recent negotiation history, there's also going to be a good book by Bob Gallucci and others from Brookings in the next few months that talks about the '94 history and then brings it up to date. But if you know that history, you know that the North Koreans were trying to use their missile program to get resources as well. So this is a country, in my judgment, that has a broken economy, that knows it needs to find some way to extort resources. Right now, they're counterfeiting and drug smuggling. That's about their best source of hard currency, hoping the money from Japanese pachinko parlors doesn't dry up as the Japanese increasingly clamp down on them because of the kidnapping issue, where the North Koreans, and I'll say more about this in a minute, but as you know, the North Koreans tried to take a tentative step towards improving relations with Japan by letting 5 kidnapping victims go back to Japan last fall. And then they got all offended when the Japanese wouldn't send the 5 back after their little furlough. And the North Koreans didn't let anybody else go. And the Japanese got very nationalistic and indignant, as I think we would in this country too under similar circumstances. And so now the North Koreans felt like their rapprochement effort with the Japanese didn't work, and the Japanese are getting a little tougher on the North Koreans than they used to. So under these circumstances, the North Koreans have counterfeiting, drug smuggling, pachinko parlors, a little bit of concrete, a little bit of textiles, and that's it for hard currency earnings. I just do not believe they're going to give up their nuclear weapons for a piece of paper that says we're not going to attack, when they really sit down at the end of the day, I don't really think they fear that we're going to attack anyhow. They know the South Koreans have no interest in seeing this attack. They know that half our army is in Iraq. They know that even Mr. Rumsfeld wants to squeeze them economically. He's not proposing military preemption. Yeah, I'm sure there are a couple of North Korean generals who are worried about military preemption, but I just do not believe, myself, that that is the underlying motivation of the North Koreans. So this non-aggression pledge is just not going to be good enough, in my judgment, even if we continue to promote it, even if Mr. Bush continues with this presidential diplomacy of trying to develop the idea further and present it to the North Koreans in negotiations that may resume next month. Okay, so we're in this quandary. The North Koreans only have 1 or 2 good national assets. The nuclear weapons program is the big one. We cannot afford to give them incentives to get rid of it because that's appeasement. They cannot afford to give it up without big incentives because that's giving away their only real national asset for no appreciable material benefit. So how do you get out of this fix? How do you enlarge the problem and therefore make it easier to solve? Well, our proposal, again, is this grand bargain. And let me say, we're not necessarily looking for a 10,000-page treaty that solves every problem under the sun, including, you know, everything from human rights to economic reform to political engagement. We would be prepared to accept actual progress incrementally. In fact, you would have to make progress incrementally because it's going to take a while to do all the things we want to see done. But our basic argument is North Korean economic malaise and decline is the root of the problem. And there is no way that you can get out of this cycle of blackmail and extortion unless you begin to force the North Koreans to reform their economy, and over time, to begin to reform even their political system. Now, you might say that's crazy. Yeah, it's crazy, but Vietnam did it. Yeah, it's crazy, but China did it. These are two communist countries that 30 and 40 years ago had regimes that looked just about as bad to us here in the United States as the North Korean regime does today. And it probably were, in many ways, just as bad, especially Mao in China. And yet, these two countries have allowed economic entrepreneurial activity, they've allowed a growing market sector, and they've gradually made some political reforms. And things are much better. I would be delighted if North Korea could become another Vietnam, for example. I think that has to be the image, because if you don't get North Korea to that sort of trajectory and to that sort of moving in that kind of direction, they're going to have no choice but to keep producing more crises to try to extort more resources, because otherwise their broken economy will not sustain itself. And that's really the core of that's our first main observation, or the core of our diagnosis of what's driving this problem. And then we say, well, there are two reasons why the economy is so bad, two reasons among many others, but the two big reasons are it's a communist system and they spend way too much on their military. And these problems are linked, but they're somewhat distinct as well. So how do you solve them? Well, you have to have a negotiating agenda with North Korea that forces them to cut their military, the conventional military, not just the nuclear forces, the conventional military. They have 1 million people under arms in a population of about 22 million. We have 1.4 million under arms in a population of 280 million. We're the superpower. They've got 10 times the rate of people under arms that we do. We spend about 4% of our gross domestic product on the military. And that number is artificially high these days because of the war and the operation in Iraq. They spend 25 to 30% of their gross domestic product on their military, by far the highest ratio in the world. Both these last two things I mentioned, number of people under arms as a percentage of the population, and GDP devoted to the defense sector, are by far the highest in the world. There's just no way they can reform their economy under these circumstances. And then secondly, they have this terrible Stalinist system, which is just as bad as any communist economy has ever been in the world, if not one of the worst examples, because they combine communism with complete economic isolation, or nearly complete economic isolation, this concept of juche. And so you put those two together, they're cut off from the world, very little trade, very little foreign investment, except what they can convince the South Koreans to do in the way of golf resorts and tourist destinations, but it's not meaningful interaction at a more general level. And those two problems prevent them from any meaningful recovery. So we have to do two things with our negotiating agenda. We have to force them to cut their conventional military, and we have to push them to reform their economy by more market reforms. To cut the conventional military, we say you can build on precedent, the treaty we had with the Soviets over conventional forces in Europe, and you can verify a treaty that cuts airplanes, tanks, artillery, etc., because these things are fairly easy to see from satellites, and because we know how to do monitoring on the ground as well. So we can do that sort of thing. It doesn't guarantee they'll spend less on the military. They could always put the same people into other jobs and do other things instead of driving tanks and flying airplanes. But if you cut the conventional military forces on the two sides of the DMZ roughly in half, we think it will tend to push the North Koreans towards economic reform. We think the South Koreans can afford this sort of cut because if you look at the South Korean military, there's a very interesting dynamic at work. The South Korean military is pretty good. It's gotten quite good. I would call it one of the 10 best militaries in the world. It's 600,000 people in the active duty force, It's about a $15 billion a year budget, has a lot of high-tech capability. Lockheed Martin is involved in some joint projects with them. They work very well with American forces. But also, they have not modernized the entirety of their force. And so if they were going to do 50% force cuts, it would be very natural to keep the better 50% and reduce or eliminate the less good, more obsolete equipment. And therefore, actually, on balance, they're not going to lose that much capability. We wouldn't have to cut our forces much at all because they're very small to begin with. So we could make some symbolic cut. But if joint allied forces cut their capability by 50%, we could just reduce by a couple thousand people or so out of the 37,000 we have there now. The North Koreans, meanwhile, would have to cut up thousands and thousands of artillery tubes, tanks, and so forth. And this is going to allow them to begin to then take those military resources and hopefully put them to some extent into economic reform. And then we would say to the North Koreans, you've got to do economic reform by building up these free enterprise zones, and we'll help you. We and the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Chinese and the Russians will help you. We will provide economic aid, not in the form of cash, because we know what you do with cash, and it ain't too pretty to talk about. It goes into the pockets of a small elite, and you waste it. And you build palaces for Kim Jong-il, and you exploit your people. We're not going to give you cash, at least not in any large sums, but we will build up the infrastructure in these economic zones. We will help train people of your own population who come to work in these zones. But you not only have to consider this, we're going to make you do it. We're going to make you accept our generosity, and we're going to make you try to develop these economic zones, or the deal is off, because this is integral to the whole thing. And you've got to allow some market reforms to go on in these zones. Now, this may sound like pie in the sky, but the North Koreans already have these zones. It's just that, unlike the Field of Dreams concept, if you create this zone in North Korea, no one will come, because no one's that nuts to throw their money into North Korea today. The South Koreans put a little in. They're trying to buy peace, essentially, through these kinds of engagement strategies. But there's no meaningful effect on the North Korean economic system. It doesn't really work. It doesn't work as a way to make money for a foreign firm. So you have to improve the political atmosphere by getting a deal on the nuclear weapons as part of this at the same time. That gives American firms and Japanese firms and Chinese and South Korean firms confidence that war is not going to destroy their investment. And then you have to protect the legal system and the legal code that guarantees the private property in these zones. And again, the North Koreans have done this on paper, but their word cannot be trusted today. And then you put money into these zones to build up the infrastructure. And all this has to be part of the deal. And this is the basic main centerpiece of our proposal, in addition to resolving the nuclear question. There are other things in our deal as well. I don't want to talk too much longer, though. Let me just say that we do think the North Koreans have to begin a human rights dialogue, and they have to let the Japanese kidnapping victims go home. First of all, if you don't let the Japanese kidnapping victims go home, you're not going to get any aid from the Japanese. And we need that as part of the way to make this whole concept work. And if you don't begin to improve the conditions in these North Korean gulags, which are very akin to Stalin's gulags in many ways, there's just no way the United States as a country can stand behind this kind of a policy. We cannot provide this level of generosity to a Stalinist regime that continues to oppress its people with no willingness to consider any improvement in this situation. I'm not saying we can expect them to turn into a democracy overnight or to open up all their prisons overnight. We got to insist upon a dialogue on human rights conditions in those prisons and in the country more generally. They have to eliminate their chemical weapons, because these are also illegal internationally. So they have to join the Chemical Weapons Convention and allow us to verify they're destroying these weapons. All this has to be part of the grand bargain. But now let me get to the objections, and I'll wrap up here. The first objection might be, it's just too much. How can you do all this at once? You're dealing with a regime that doesn't even know how to negotiate simple issues, that's been closed off for decades, that has only a very small elite of officials who have ever dealt with the Western world. How can you possibly talk about solving the nuclear crisis, cutting conventional forces in half, jump-starting economic reform, eliminating chemical weapons, and resolving some of these human rights issues, or at least beginning a dialogue, all at once? And our response is, you don't have to accomplish this all at once. You've got to put it on the table all at once and to set out the vision. Because you need to show the North Koreans they have a choice between reform a la Vietnam or the hole they're still in with the situation getting worse. Because we will turn up the pressure if things don't get better. You have to confront them with that choice. And you can be very flexible on the implementation. If you can find a solution to the nuclear question and the other stuff has to be more gradual, that's fine. And I know it's going to take 5 or 10 years to do the economic reform. It's going to take 2 to 5 years to cut up the excess conventional weapons. It's going to take 2 to 5 years to eliminate the chemical weapons. And the human rights situation won't improve in North Korea to, at least not to Western standards, for many decades. So you have to be patient about the implementation of some of this. But you have to put the whole idea on the table. Because you've got to get economic reform part of this, and you've got to get a broader engagement about human rights and diplomacy part of this. If they will do all that, we can be generous. We can help provide aid. We can give them diplomatic ties. We can sign this non-aggression pledge with the other countries in the region. We can lift economic sanctions that prevent most U.S. DPRK trade. And we can phase these things in so that we always have the ability to pull back if they don't keep their word. So those are some of the basic concepts. I have a good friend who used to work on East Asia policy in the Clinton administration who was reading our book a couple weeks ago, and he called me up and he said, Mike, I just wanted to congratulate you on your book. It's nicely done. You got it out quickly. It's the right time. It's well argued. It's nicely written. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it's otherwise fine. You know, it was a pretty good line. He's a funny guy, but he half meant it. And he said also, if the Democrats ever win, I'm going to make sure we hire you to deal with the North Koreans so you can implement this plan of yours and have fun. And I am a Democrat, although I wouldn't rule out trying to implement this plan with the Bush administration if they want to hire me either. But in any event, that's perhaps less likely. What my friend meant was that, you know, again, how can you possibly overload the diplomatic circuitry this way? How can you possibly do all these things with North Korea? We never did that much all at once with the Soviets, even after 15 or 20 years of negotiating experience. We built up the whole détente process. We got very good at summits. We had people like my boss, Strobe Talbot, writing books about the history of the summits and negotiations. We had people who got to know each other on both sides, who could speak in a common language, not just in terms of the actual language they were using, but in terms of their understanding of the sophisticated terminology of nuclear weapons and conventional forces. And it took decades to get to that point with the Soviets. How can you possibly presume to do this in a short time with the North Koreans? Well, of course, there are two answers to that question. One is, okay, you got me. We can't. We won't be able to. But the other answer is, again, you don't have to do it all at once. And we do have all these other precedents now to draw upon. We have cut conventional forces deeply with the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact in the CFE Treaty, signed towards the end of the Cold War between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. We have done on-site inspections to verify the elimination of excess weaponry with the Soviets for a number of treaties, including nuclear weapons, conventional forces, and now we have this global chemical weapons convention. We know how to do this. We have the Chinese who know how to do economic reform within a communist system. They know how to build up economic entrepreneurial zones, even as the communist economy nominally remains and the communist government remains in charge. So all the different pieces are individually doable, and we have the key parties involved, China, Russia, countries that have at least some ability to talk to the North Koreans, and some experience in doing all of these things. The South Koreans, for us right now, are often hard to deal with. U.S.-ROK relations are not that good. Mr. Bush is inclined towards a hard line. The South Koreans, under President No, are inclined towards the same kind of sunshine policy that President Kim Dae-jung had from '98 to 2003 during his presidency. But the good news is, at least the South Koreans and the North Koreans are getting along better. And the South Koreans are prepared to be generous towards the North Koreans, and there's a little more trust there. So when you put it all together, a lot of the pieces have been tried and tested and practiced before, and the parties who learned how to do them are present in these six-party negotiations. And I like Mr. Bush's idea of these six-party negotiations. I think that's a step forward. But I also think, and I'll finish on this point, I think Mr. Bush also is right that we need some sticks. We need to be willing to tell the North Koreans, if you don't deal with us, we cannot allow this situation to continue. We cannot allow you to build more and more nuclear weapons. So you have to have the threat on the table as well. First an economic threat, and then later perhaps a military threat. And I think Mr. Bush's instincts are right on that. The problem is he hasn't given the North Koreans any real incentives to couple with the stick. There are no real carrots except for this piece of paper, this non-aggression pledge. Because of his strong objection to doing business with a Stalinist regime, and because of his belief that giving the North Koreans incentives would be giving in to blackmail. So I would submit to Mr. Bush, you got to enlarge the problem. You got to find a package of incentives that also forces the North Koreans to reform. Then you're not giving in to blackmail. You're essentially assisting the suicide of the existing Stalinist way of life in North Korea and forcing them to reform their economy and gradually reform their political system. You're now helping them make a transition to a new way of running their country instead of just giving them a payment for a weapons program they shouldn't have in the first place. And if they don't wind up in a radically different place at the end of this process than they are right now, and they don't agree to that, you don't give them the benefits. And you do not provide the diplomatic ties, you don't lift the trade sanctions, you do not continue the economic assistance. So it's a very tough-minded engagement strategy. And at the end of the day, if it fails, the implicit message to South Korea, Japan, China, Russia, and North Korea is we will get tougher. And you, our regional partners, should be willing to help us get tough and put more pressure on the North Koreans than you're willing to put on right now. Because if we try diplomacy and it fails, then there's no alternative. So we got to try the diplomacy first, test it, see how it works, and only then resort to coercive economic or military measures if necessary. I'm a little bit worried because this prescription could lead us to war in 2 or 3 years, a war that would be 10 to 100 times bloodier than the war we just experienced in Iraq and that we continue to experience even today. So it's a very daunting and sobering scenario to contemplate. But I agree with former Secretary Perry when he says, if the threat of force is credible, the North Koreans will make a deal because they don't want war. They know what it would mean. They know they can't win. They're not as delusional in many ways as Saddam Hussein was. And therefore, if there is a serious set of incentives together with a clear threat, I think we can work this thing out. And so that's the grand bargain proposal. I look forward to your coming after me. Hopefully you won't be as hard on me as my friend who called the plan ridiculous, but I would welcome that as well as any other reactions. So thank you.
Well, we thank you very much for a very, very clear presentation, certainly a basis for a lot of questions. Let me remind everyone there are still a half a dozen copies or so of Mr. O'Hanlon's, Dr. O'Hanlon's books available in the lobby right after the program. The floor is open for questions. I'll repeat the questions if they're from the audience. Otherwise, if they're at the microphones, we won't have to. Yes, sir. 2 questions. One, how do the North Koreans get their nuclear technology in the first place? And secondly, what role can China play in the process?
The technology, the raw materials for these programs came largely from Pakistan, Russia, a couple other countries, depending on which technology, whether it's the reactors or whether it's the uranium program. And so those are the origin. Pakistan is probably more active than Russia at this point. The reactors, the plutonium reactors, as you know, are already there, and they were operated as long as 15 years ago and produced the plutonium that was probably extracted during the first Bush administration. To the extent that North Korea has 1 or 2 bombs today, it's plutonium that was produced during the first Bush administration that we were trying to figure out a way to clamp down upon, and we're not able to quickly enough. And I think Secretary Baker, if he were here, would give a much more critical take on the Clinton administration's approach to North Korea policy. But the fact remains, and I don't criticize the first Bush administration for this fact, that's when the plutonium was made. So the plutonium issue goes back in time. The Pakistanis are perhaps still giving uranium enrichment technology to the North Koreans, although now that we've uncovered the program, it's a little harder for the Pakistanis to keep doing that. But the bottom line is that the North Koreans now have enough technology to keep this going on their own. As to the Chinese angle, you know, there's always more the Chinese could do. They have really helped us in these talks, the April and August talks. But the Chinese leverage is limited as well. I think what the Chinese can say to North Korea is, listen, if there's a war that happens because of this nuclear program, even though we have an alliance with you, we are not coming to your help in any way, shape, or form. That's one thing the Chinese can say. I think they're coming closer and closer to saying that. In fact, I think it's already clear to the North Koreans that if North Korea starts a war, the Chinese won't help. My own belief is even if we started the war by a preemptive strike, the Chinese would not help the North Koreans. But I'm not sure the Chinese have been fully blunt about that yet. And so we could hope for them to do more of that. But otherwise, the Chinese are in about the same predicament we are. All we give the North Koreans, and all they give the North Koreans, is food aid. Do you really want to punish the North Korean population for the sins of their leaders? And they give them some energy assistance and a little bit of cross-border trade. So they could get, I think that what you have to do with the Chinese is not expect that they have any magic wand today. I don't think they do. But I believe if they can accept the basic logic of this grand bargain, we try serious diplomacy first. If it doesn't work, we get tougher. We put on UN sanctions. We put on much tougher trade constraints, and we consider military force. And the whole international community supports that notion. I think that's where the Chinese could be helpful in signing on to this plan. But the Chinese are not going to sign on to this plan until the Bush administration signs on to it, or something like it. I don't want to come across so presumptuous as to think they're going to adopt exactly our proposal, but something like this. And the bad news is the Chinese, the Japanese, and the South Koreans and the Russians are all much happier with our book than the Bush administration. And so I don't believe we can ask the Chinese to do a lot more until we change our own policy.
At what point can we expect verifiable nuclear inspections, and when would it be destroyed? I think that's the big issue. And how much do we have to concede or grand bargain away until we verify this?
I think we need to insist that the North Koreans stop their plutonium reprocessing to the extent it's still happening right away, as part of, even in the course of negotiations. And we can resume the shipments of fuel oil right away as a sign of good faith. I would make that deal and insist on that right away. Then there's the question of this underground uranium enrichment plant. No one really knows how advanced it is. I saw some press reports today that it wasn't as far advanced as we might have previously thought. A year ago, a U.S. government official thought that it was almost completed, could be operational within the next 12 to 18 months. I'm not sure we still have that view. That plant is relatively small in any event. I think we can wait a couple of years to get our hands on that. The 1 or 2 nuclear bombs they may already have from the plutonium they made during the first Bush administration, I think we can wait a year or 2 or 3 or 4 to get our hands on that. And that gives them some confidence that we are being true to this deal, and gives them some confidence that Mr. Bush is not secretly launching a plan to attack them as soon as he pulls American forces out of Iraq. So I think it's understandable. I mean, I belittled the North Korean security worry before, but I do think we may have to accommodate a little bit of it and say to the North Koreans, we're not going to insist that you give up all of your nuclear capabilities until several years down the road. But the new production has to stop right away, and then we need to phase in inspections, on-site inspections, on the ground, for these other capabilities, and ultimately you have to give back the plutonium you already have, let's say within a 5 to 8 year time horizon. So stop the new production, freeze it, undo whatever reprocessing they've done in the last few months. If they've reprocessed in the last few months, we should get that plutonium out of North Korea quickly and insist on that. But then we can be more patient about the 1 or 2 bombs they already have and the uranium program. We would verifying it immediately would also mean being able to target it immediately. So I don't think it's realistic for us to say, show us your 1 or 2 plutonium bombs tomorrow. I don't think we can do that until we've built up more trust, because as soon as they show us those bombs, we can destroy them militarily. Now maybe we can get them to let the Chinese in to look at those 1 or 2 bombs. But I'm not sure what good that's going to do us if they're not going to give the bombs up for a few years anyway. So I'm more worried in the short term about stopping the reprocessing, making them give up whatever plutonium they've reprocessed this year, letting the inspectors back in to verify the nuclear capability, that it's not being used to make more material, and then in the next 2 to 3 to 4 or 5 years, get our hands on the 1 or 2 bombs they may already have and the uranium program.
The proposals that I just heard, I mean, it seems like any change in North Korea threatens Kim Jong-il and his narrow band of leaders. And I'm trying to understand, it may be that he doesn't want much change because any change threatens him. What is really his motivation to go months beyond the extortion and the bribery and the stuff that he's got going for him now, because he controls whatever wealth they do have?
That is why we need to be clear about threats. We need to make Kim Jong-il realize the status quo is not acceptable, and we will not accept it. And ultimately, Bill Perry was right. A North Korean nuclear arsenal is not consistent with American security. There's too high of a chance that it would embolden the North Koreans to act more aggressively, that it could lead to an arms race, a nuclear arms competition in East Asia. The South Koreans, the Japanese, maybe even the Taiwanese would go nuclear. There is still this threat they made back in April about exporting nuclear material to foreign customers. Even if they chose not to repeat that threat, it's still a worry because it's a regime that's exported many things before. We have to tell the North Koreans, for all these reasons, your nuclear program is unacceptable to us. And we will find a way to convince Seoul, Tokyo, and Beijing that it's unacceptable. And we will find a way to show those three capitals that diplomacy has been attempted, so that if diplomacy fails, coercion or military force will be considered. And I think that's the mess. That's why you need a stick. Because I agree with you. Otherwise, Kim Jong-il is just going to try to find a way to milk out a few hundred million here or there, and that's all he really needs to satisfy his own immediate demands and his ability to survive in power. And he knows that if he starts reform, he can't necessarily fully control it. So you got to threaten him that the status quo is not acceptable. You've also got to bring in the Chinese and the Russians to help him get more comfortable with the idea of reform, that there are ways to do it that don't lead to his demise. I hate to think of protecting Kim Jong-il's rule as being part of the grand bargain. But unfortunately, if you don't do it, then I think your critique is going to be a backbreaker for the whole concept, and he will not deal unless he can convince himself that he can still stay in power while he does it. So I think you need a combination of the Chinese teaching him how to do reform within a communist society and the threat of military force being on the table to remind him that the status quo is not acceptable. Something has to give. It's his choice whether he tries reform, or whether he leads us to economic coercion and then military force.
Sir, you mentioned economic reform, political reform, the drawback of conventional forces. Now, having been to Seoul and seeing the combat air patrols, the being in range of North Korean artillery, curfews, combat patrols along the DMZ, how is the psychological impact going to be if we suddenly take away what's been ingrained in these two countries for the last 50 years? The Bush administration's admitted to underestimating the impact on the Iraqi people. We expected them to jump up and help us out, and 6 months later, we're still having problems in Baghdad and Karbala and all over Iraq. So if you take away what the focus and just what they've been living with and completely change it backwards in only 2 to 5 years, what can we expect? North Koreans now undertaking terrorist acts or what?
Let me say a couple of things. One is that if we cut these military forces in half, that's just one piece of what you were alluding to, you're still going to maintain a strong deterrent near the DMZ on both sides, because we're not going to insist the North Koreans pull all their forces back 100 miles. That's not realistic. They know that they need to have Seoul in range of some of their artillery as a deterrent. I think that's very ingrained in their thinking. And so our plan for conventional force cuts, even though it's dramatic in one sense, does not change the basic situation that you described when you began about combat air patrols and constant monitoring and forces near each other near the DMZ. It just reduces the size of those two forces on the two sides, but it doesn't eliminate that. So I think that makes the transition a little easier. Unfortunately, Seoul is still within range of North Korean artillery at the end of our plan, but that may mean that it's easier for North Korea to accept. You were also, I think, alluding to broader issues like the psychology of the North Korean people and how they would handle this sort of thing. They've been cut off for so long, and I think you're right to raise the question, can they really adapt in a short period of time to a new world? I would say no. They're still going to be closed off from much of the world. Kim Jong-il is not going to want them to be reading, you know, the New York Times and the Washington Times in 2 to 5 years. He is not going to be wanting to hold elections, even at the local level, in 2 to 5 years. And he is not going to want them even to travel freely all the time back and forth. He'll have to allow some level of family reunions, I think, as part of this deal. But he's still going to want to control them. And I think we can live with that. We can live with gradual reform of North Korean society as long as the direction is the right way, as long as the economy is getting better instead of worse, as long as people are at least putting food in their bellies instead of starving, and as long as human rights are getting gradually more tolerable instead of having people brutalized in these prison camps. So I don't expect miracles in terms of North Korean society. I just want to reverse the downslide and put the direction in a positive way. And then the overall reform of North Korea, you know, I'm sure you and I would agree that Vietnam hasn't fully reformed, even though it's been embarked on this process for 20-some years. Likewise, if North Korea follows our plan, they're not going to fully change for decades. But at least they can hopefully stop being the acute threat to our global security interests that they are right now. I know that's not a complete answer, but...
Yeah, good, thank you.
If you talk about cutting the North Korean military in half, talking about 500,000 people without jobs, and perhaps some of them can be absorbed by South Korea. There's still some family ties there, or they're getting pretty old at this point. And I suppose China might be able to absorb people, but that's an awful lot of unemployed, perhaps unskilled people that you got to do something about.
For me, that's 500,000 people who are able-bodied, young, and energetic. They're the kind of 500,000 people the North Koreans need to make these economic zones work. Now, I'm not suggesting that the North Koreans are going to dismantle army units one day and have all the people flow up to the special economic zones the next. But that's the trend you want to encourage. And those are the people the North Koreans need to have working in these factories and other kinds of private economic enterprises that are going to be created in these special economic zones. Vietnam and China both reduced their military expenditures and the size of their armed forces as they reformed. And you know, one more point, there is a way to go with a middle ground here, in the sense that our proposal only does things that are verifiable. We don't trust the North Koreans, and we won't trust them even if they sign this deal. So you only do things you can verify. You cannot verify how many people they have in their military. All you can verify is the large weaponry they have in their military. So the North Koreans, in theory, could keep some of those 500,000 people in the military, at least on a provisional or temporary basis. And our plan would not change that fact. So if they want to make the manpower transition more gradual, they still can under this proposal.
Dr. O'Hanlon, we thank you very much for what I think is an important contribution.